Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Real Talk with Life After Grief, Chris. This particular podcast, I'm going to be talking about life transitions, and this is going to be the last podcast of the season. I'm reflecting on a conference that I just went to, and the conference was based on financial professionals, specifically certified financial planners who focus exclusively on life transitions. And if you know anything about me, my financial practice is based on working with clients in grief. So I work exclusively with folks that are in some sort of life transition. In this particular conference, there were two speakers in particular that have real life experience, and they translated this real life experience into really helping people and helping clients in particular. And I'm going to start out with the gentleman by the name of Toby. So this gentleman, he and his wife were trying to have a child for a long time. And he was very candid and very open about his experience. And they were attempting to have a child through IVF, in vitro fertilization. And what they didn't know on the front end was all of the medical stuff that goes on with IVF, and then all of the, frankly, the mental anguish and anticipation that goes on with IVF. If my memory serves me correctly, they went through a few rounds. There's a lot of hope. There was a lot of sadness. There was a lot of dismay. And there was a great expense that was carried on with IVF. And Toby, the gentleman that was speaking in particular, talked about his experience, like I just mentioned. He and his wife grieved because their IVF failed at certain points. And he actually wrote a book. He's a natural writer, formal education wise, and he's a poet. And he wrote a book. And that wasn't the end of this story. At the end of his book, that was at the end of one of the failed IVF cycles. After he wrote his book, he and his wife became pregnant, and they ended up having a son. And son is, I believe, 7 now. And it was a great testament to what life has to offer you, but also having that grit and having that resilience and surviving things that life throws at you. And that's made him a much better planner because he has this real life experience of a life transition of trying to have children and it not being very easy. And then he and his wife grieve differently and they get through it and onto the other side where they have a child. And I would call that life after grief. That type of loss is different, but very similar to having an actual loss. If someone thinks of a death in a family, I believe he called it ambiguous loss, kind of something that is not necessarily tangible, but it's definitively a loss. So that was a very humbling moment to witness that of a gentleman speaking on stage about his experience and from his vantage point of IVF and his experience with his wife. And his wife was very private and she had said yes, that he can talk about this, but it's not something that she would want to talk about as well. Her name was Alexi. She's a certified financial planner as well. And she talked about specifically child loss. Hers was very touching to me. And I'm going to describe something that someone described about me. Alexi described that she and her husband were pregnant some years ago. They had a baby girl. And when the baby girl was born, she had severe complications and they actually had to airlift her to another hospital, if my memory serves me correctly, and she didn't survive. As she described this situation, one of my peers was behind me. She was witnessing a visual reaction from me. She said after the session was over, she said, "Chris, I noticed that you were tensing up during her conversation when she was speaking. I had no idea." Then during the presentation, she had a picture of her family. She has 2 young children that are living. And with her husband in this picture, she had a picture of a bear, I believe her husband was holding. And she said, "Does anybody notice something interesting about this picture?" And I think I was the only one in the audience that realized the bear symbolized a child who had passed away. And I raised my hand and I said that, and she's, "Yes, that's exactly right." And so it really hit home for me because I've not met really anybody in my travels where I could have a conversation with them about the death of a child, specifically their oldest child. She's gone on to describing what happened. And then another thing that she had described was she and her husband chose to tell their two children about their older sister as soon as they were able to speak and comprehend and listen to things. These things really hit home for me because it's a real life situation that people go through, maybe not very much talked about, but it is a real life situation. And that's a situation a planner went through and has translated that to real life. So I took the opportunity after the conversation that she had, that Alexi had, and I went up to her and I spoke to her, and we were just talking about her experience with child loss and then my experience with child loss. And one of the things that I had never been able to really talk to anybody else about was, at what point do you tell your children? That is something that's very unique, but it's a real life experience. My wife and I chose to tell the boys about their brother, Christopher, probably 3 or 4 years ago. Again, I'm the planner, and I wanted to make sure that we had everything set up and just in case. And we had counselors lined up. We had books. We told our boys about their brother. And the first thing that they said is, why didn't you guys tell us earlier? And it was such a relief to us that through a child's lens, that it was just so simplistic. And they're very happy and didn't know about their brother. Alexi and I were talking about that dynamic. And then she got a little bit deeper with me, and she had asked me, how did the hospital treat you in this dynamic when you had the loss of a child? And I said they were great. And they gave us a box. There was pictures and a memento. And from my conversation with Alexi, it was very apparent that she's had conversations with other parents who have lost children very early on. And she said, not every hospital is like that. Sometimes they are just treating the parents and the child like a number. And I had no idea, never even thought about that. So then I was thinking also about Alexi in terms of that experience, and then how it translates into her potentially helping out other people. And her tragedy is a gift because she now has this very specific lens to help other folks in their capacity. And this conference embodied everything that I experienced and everything that I heard with regard to helping clients in transition. And one of the things that a few financial planners and I were talking about when we meet with clients, are very specific clients within our niche, if you will. And again, mine is grief. And we talk about finance and we get all the finances done. But what we found is that the financial component is a piece of the pie. The transition is a huge piece of the pie. And what I've known for a long time, there are two pieces in regards to finances, and there's the technical side and there's the emotional side. What I've known for a very long time is the technical side, and your brain doesn't make the decisions if there are decisions that to be made that are both technical and emotional. The emotional side dictates decision making, good, bad, or indifferent. But I know that as a planner, and going into that aspect is very important that I, as a planner, understand that. And I work around that in my skill set. And again, going to this conference, and I'm going to highlight, it was Sudden Money Institute, and it was a factor of my certified financial transitionist designation. And that's why I was at this conference. It gives me a very specific tool bag of things that I can do with clients that are in any kind of life transition. And I'm just thinking about some clients that have been in a transition one way or another, and some of the things that I've done to help them through their transition. And one of the first things that I do, and I've probably spoken about this in a previous podcast, I do something that is called a communication preference. I want to know how a client wants to be communicated to, whether it is text message, whether it is phone call, whether it's Zoom call, whether it's in person, how often they want to meet, how they want to receive information. And again, is that elaborate, or do they want me to give them a list of options and they pick the best one? Or do they want me to just give them a couple of options? And probably the most important thing that I've taken from this communication preferences, again, this is just one tool that I use, is when a client that is in transition pulls back and they go silent. What is my protocol? And I can tell you definitively, any client that I've worked with that has been in some sort of a life transition, whether it was the death of a parent, whether it was the death of a child, whether it was the death of a spouse, they have all pulled back at some point. And I don't wonder why they are pulling back. In my communication preferences, I have them highlight in a very specific way, what do I do when you pull back? And what will it look like when you pull back? And when I know that early on and we hit that moment when they do pull back, I know exactly what to do. And it's based on what the client tells me. There's some other tools in my tool basket that I do. And again, it's a result of my formal training. It's managing expectations. That's another tool. And there's many tools, but it's managing expectations. What I find commonly in families, it gets very complex. And who are the major players? And how are the expectations of those other players influencing my client? And how do we work around those and make it such that my client continues to progress through their cycle, specifically their grieving life cycle, in a positive format? What can I do to take a lot of the things off of their plate? And then this other tool, this is probably the most exciting part for me, is this idea of a bliss list. And so this bliss list is, you're at a point in time now where things are not going as you would like. I bring in this idea that you're at a point in time where, again, things aren't going as well as you'd like. You have the opportunity, and I have an opportunity with you to help that get to the other side. And again, I call that life after grief. This is formally called the bliss list. What if there was no money, no time, and no constraints? What would your life look like? And I'll give you an example of mine. And so my bliss list, before I took this training, I did a lot of things innately just because of all the trauma and all of the stuff that I had faced. My bliss list was to do exactly what I'm doing now. And it was for me to be in a position to where I could spend a lot of time and energy with my family. And I'm living that now. And that's because I've seen so much, and things can be just snuffed out in a moment. And I never wanted to take that for granted. And so my bliss list is to be able to coach my boys. My bliss list is to be able to go on weekly dates with my wife. My bliss list is to be able to travel with my family. My bliss list is also to be able to pick up my boys whenever they need to be picked up from school or from sports. I wasn't able to do that when I was working for a firm before, and it was really taxing on me. I try to keep things simplistic. A client of mine, her bliss list was to build a new house and to live there and be worry-free. She's living that. It's just very important for me to live a fulfilled life and help other folks live a fulfilled life as well. So as I reflect on this particular conference, I just thought I would share that in a couple stories from some real life folks that are planners, such as myself, and do very good work for other people. Something else that I'm trying out, and my boys inspire me to do this, is to video my podcast and then also put it on social media platforms. And my boys get excited about YouTube because they watch YouTube all the time. They encourage me to, get my own channel, which I had before, but I didn't use it in this format. And they encouraged me to try to get subscribers. So with that being said, please subscribe. I will see you next season.